Topic 6. Civil Wars and Julius Caesar's solution. So Julius Caesar is the last man standing. Pompey's dead, Crassus is dead, and now the question is, will the Republic be dead? Especially now that Caesar's son, Caesarion, now, let's see, Caesarion is a Greek name, little Caesar, son of Caesar, but his mother is not Roman. Some recent speculation is that maybe she was granted some protection of citizenship, but in fact, can some people see Caesarion as a half-breed? Or will Julius Caesar try to treat Caesarion as an heir? Now, Caesar is a pretty smart guy. Remember, he didn't have Pompey's money or Crassus's money. He didn't have their military experience either. And yet, he won. Remember I said that you would probably bet 50% on Crassus, 50% on Pompey, and 0% on Julius Caesar. And yet he won. And so that military success, you have to kind of look at Julius Caesar as the man in the myth. And the man and the myth went together because he realized his weaknesses. That's one of the really interesting things about Julius Caesar, is that he realized he needed that military experience and that he didn't have it. And quite frankly, he didn't know whether he had an inclination for it. Turned out that he did. He knew he needed the support of the people. In fact, the first thing that he got elected to, his first elected office, was as Pontifex Maximus. And that was still a very important role in the Republic, as that chief voice, that chief priest. And he spent so much money, every dime he had, and bribing and all that stuff, that he went home and he said, you know, the next day was the election, because Pontifex Maximus was elected. And he said, tomorrow morning I will be everything or nothing, based on what happened. Well, he won as Pontifex Maximus, and that became a very important job, such that all of the people who followed him as emperors had that title, Pontifex Maximus. It's a title that in fact resounds in history. The Pope in Rome, among his other titles, is called Pontifex Maximus, the chief bridge builder. Pont Max, as it's sometimes seen on tombs, or even PM, doesn't mean prime minister. It means Pontifex Maximus, although in essence, I guess he is a prime minister. So his military strategy and his success paid off in Gaul and in Britain. Of course, we have very few other examples, other sources to use. Most of the sources are Caesar's commentaries. But it does seem that he did some smart things when he won. One of the things that he did to win was to go into an area and figure out who's fighting. And then he would figure out who's stronger, and then he would try to get those people on his side and get the enemies of his enemies to be his friends. And he would kind of play these games so that maybe they would kill each other more frequently than him having to send his men into danger. And that worked any number of times. And he also knew that he had to hire local scouts, because the local scouts knew the lay of the land. And then when he won, he made sure he gave plenty of war booty, spoils, to his men. And this bound them together, because he knew when they went back, they would be his political force, his brothers in arms. And so what he did in the aftermath of Pompey's death in Egypt in 48 BC was that he kind of consolidated his power without showing his hands too early. I mean, it's pretty clear that he wanted supreme control. And he had himself named, he manipulated the Senate so that he would be named dictator and consul in alternating years. Now, it used to be that dictator was a position of military urgency that would be given not on a regular basis, only when it absolutely was necessary, and it would be given for a limited period of time. Typically 6 to 12 months, half a year to 1 year. The most famous dictator in history, now here dictator doesn't have the negative dictator of Hitler or Stalin or Mussolini, but in a sense of military emergency, Rome had a tradition of giving all power, like martial law, in the hands of one person who would dictate, dicta, speak the commands to get things set. And the most famous one was Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus the farmer, who in 458 BC was given rule for 6 months. It took him 16 days to take care of the threat, and when he was done at the end of 16 days, he could have had plenty of power for 5.5 more months. He lays his sword down, and he returns power, because reluctantly he left his farm, and joyously he returned to it. And this became a model for George Washington in our own history. And after the war, George Washington established a veterans association called the Sons of Cincinnatus. And that society still exists. So dictator and consul in alternating years shows people that he has power and he has the army, but consul is a legislative role, so an executive role and a legislative role, and people are not quite sure how this is going to work out. And finally, he gets himself elected dictator for life, gets himself elected, meaning he manipulates that. And he does some things that are smart but also dangerous. One thing he does that's dangerous is a senator's toga had a purple border, purple being the royal color, right? So a senator's toga had a purple border. He began to wear all purple. That set him apart from others. He gave citizenship to all soldiers, regardless of where they came from, even if they were not Italian in a modern ethnic sense, but if they didn't come from the boot of Italy, if they were from Spain or Gaul or even areas on the borders with Germany, because they had earned it, he said. They had fought for the right to be a Roman citizen. Well, you make me a Roman citizen, that protects my wife, it protects my kids, I pass it down to my boys. And he had plans to keep the populace happy. Remember, that's what he was learning from the Gracchi brothers, from Sulla and Cinna, from both positive and negative examples. Keep the soldiers happy, keep the people happy, make sure people have jobs. And so he had plans. One of the plans was to refurbish the laws. We think more in favor of the plebeians than of the optimates or the patricians. To build a library for all, which would increase literacy. To get education, not for all, but for a broader portion of people. And he even reforms the calendar. One of the things he falls in love with in Egyptian culture, apart from Cleopatra, is the calendar. Because in the ancient world there were many calendars, and the calendar that ends up being the Julian calendar, which lasts until the late 1500s CE, the Julian calendar adapts the Egyptian calendar, and in the ancient world the Egyptian calendar was the best calendar, and it had to be the best calendar because there's a very narrow growing season in Egypt. You have to know when you can plant based on the flooding of the Nile. 1, 2, 3 days can make a huge difference. And so the Egyptian calendar was excellent. It had some of the best math around. And so he adapts that calendar. He moves things around. He gives himself, rather humbly, gives himself what becomes July, because there had been 10 months. So January, February, March, April, May, June, July, and then August. Augustus is going to do the same. September, the 7th month, doesn't make any sense unless you've inserted July and August in there. October the 8th, November the 9th, December the 10th. So he sticks those other 2 months in there. And that calendar is a very good calendar. It's off only by a little bit, and it takes about 1,600 years for them to have to change the calendar again when it was off by about 11 or 12 days. So here's a man who changes time, changes the very passage of time. And of course, he had built his own myth. He was his own best PR machine. Where had he learned that? Julius Caesar. Didn't I say that Julius Caesar knew his history? And Julius Caesar cried when he saw a statue of Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great was here and gone at the age of 33. And when he was 35, 40, Julius Caesar saw that statue and he wept. "Why are you crying?" his friends asked. "Because this man conquered the known world and beyond, and I've done nothing in my life." So he knew Alexander's force in keeping the soldiers happy, in being his own good PR machine. And he also put his face everywhere. Now remember, nowadays, if I hear the name of a person and I want to know, what does that person look like? I'll do a Google search and I can pretty much get a picture of almost anyone almost immediately. Well, you can't do that in those days. So how do you get his face around coins and statues? And he orders his face on coins. Now, up to now, only the gods were on coins. So this was an act of hubris, some people said. Others said, well, he's almost godlike. You're putting your face on a coin? Only gods belong on coins. He kind of gets a little close to that divinity thing, which we'll talk about in a moment. And statues of him all over the place, so people can say, this is our Caesar. And he also does something that unnerves people. It's something that in Latin is called the clementia Caesaris, the clemency or the mercy of Caesar. You see, in this culture, Maria Sulla Sina, I win, you die, it's very simple. But have you ever been in a situation, think back to when you were a child, and you expected somebody to yell, you did something wrong, and you expected your mother to raise her voice, and she didn't. In fact, she lowered her voice, and she talked to you very calmly, and you thought, what alien has taken my mother away, or my father? What's wrong, right? It puts you on edge. So by showing mercy to his enemies who deserve to die, he basically puts them in their place and keeps them in his service. He puts people on edge so that they play mind games with each other and they don't attack him. A brilliant move. Now, he wasn't unopposed because, well, let's take a scene from Shakespeare. Shakespeare's source was Plutarch. And Plutarch was the person who wrote those dual biographies of matching a Greek hero and a Roman hero. He put Caesar and Alexander together. And there's a scene in Plutarch, which is recounted in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, that king has been a bad word. King has been a four-letter word. Rex has been a four-letter word in Roman history since the time of Tarquin the Proud. Remember Tarquinius Superbus? And so there's a feast that's going on, and a bunch of the crowd is fickle and they're frenzied, and they take a laurel wreath that you would normally put on the gods' statues, and they go to put it on Caesar's head. And no, he says, Mark Antony, no, is the one offering the laurel branch. And Caesar says, no, I am not a king. And then a second time, and then a third time. And each time, as the person telling the story says, I think it's Cato, it might be Cassius, says, methinks his hand tarried a little too long. Like, oh yeah, maybe you should put it. No, I won't be king. Well, if you want me to be king. And people start to say, uh-oh, this is not going to turn out too well. And so the opposition coheres around Brutus and Cassius and Cicero. Now the irony is that the leader of the crowd who had gotten rid of Tarquin the Proud in 509 BC was named Brutus. Now, were they related? Probably not. It was a fairly common name at that time, but still an interesting parallel. Brutus, Cassius, and Cicero. Now, Cicero, I have to say, is a bit of a weakling. You know, he's a flawed hero. He's very vain. He's very weak. In fact, Plutarch and then Shakespeare after him just make him a minor character, kind of all talk and no action. In fact, he conveniently isn't around on the day of the assassination. So it's really Brutus and Cassius who are the actors, but all of them fear that they're going down the path to a monarchy, or rather they're returning down the path to a monarchy, and what they want to do is save the republic. Cicero was in a very delicate spot because he was a beneficiary, although maybe we might say a victim, of the clementia Caesaris, of the mercy of Caesar. Why? Because Cicero had followed Pompey. Therefore, he, in essence, in this system, deserved to die by Caesar's order, and Caesar had pardoned him very late in his life. So Caesar has gotten so many enemies that it reaches a critical mass, and he is assassinated on the Ides of March, famously, the play, Shakespeare's play, Beware the Ides of March, on the Ides of March by a conspiracy of Brutus and Cassius. Cicero was in on it, but he was not present. And the problem was that they had no next day plan. The problem was that they thought, oh, the Republic is just going to return. And they had no idea that the crowd might be swayed. And here's where Plutarch helps by giving an account, and Shakespeare does this, when Mark Antony doesn't know what to do. And he says, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And what happens is that Mark Antony doesn't know how to play the crowd, because the crowd, on the one hand, is furious that Caesar has been killed, but on the other hand, they did fear this Rex, this king. Well, it turns out that Caesar, no fool, had written a will in which he had given land and property and money to every single person in the city of Rome. And Mark Antony was sure he would be named the heir. Mark Antony was a protege of Julius Caesar, as Brutus had been. There was even a rumor, because Julius Caesar was quite a ladies' man, that Brutus was his son. We can't prove or disprove that. And so Mark Antony was he himself expected to be named heir, and lo and behold, Caesar, who has no legitimate children, because technically Caesarion is a bastard and certainly a half-blood in the way that they would use that term then, Julius Caesar named as his heir his 19-year-old nephew, actually a grandnephew, whose given name, whose birth name was Octavian. Mark Antony was not expecting that. And Octavian is not in Rome. I think he's in Turkey at this point. And very wisely, he's very slow to come to the city of Rome. In fact, we know, always listen to your mother. He asked his mother's advice, and his mother said, stay where you are, start to go to Rome so people see you coming to Rome to take charge, but don't rush. Take your time, because it's very unclear what's going to happen. The Senate is not just responding. The Republic is not just coming back. It seems like every 20 minutes the crowd is going back and forth. Mark Antony doesn't know what to do, and Mark Antony sees Caesarion. And he says, that's the way to do this. And Mark Antony becomes Cleopatra's lover, even though he's married. Well, that didn't stop Caesar. He was married too. And whereas Caesar was a very cultivated, elegant man, a man of champagne, Mark Antony was a beer guzzler. And Cleopatra recognizes this instantly. When she meets Mark Antony, she dresses up, high society, speaks very elegant Latin to Julius Caesar. And as soon as she realizes Mark Antony is kind of this brute, she dials her language down, she dials her clothing down, and he's captured by her. And so he, Mark Antony, becomes the protector of Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. Now there's confusion, and now it's 44, it's 43, it's 42. Who to follow? The plebeians and the soldiers don't quite know what to do. After all, the soldiers, their lives had been made better by Julius Caesar. He gave them all the war booty. He made them citizens. The plebeians, the everyday people, had gotten, Julius Caesar took his property and turned it into a public park for them, and every single one of them got a little bit of money. Whither the Senate? What about the Senate? Cicero had nudged the assassins, but he hadn't taken part. So his position was, I'm clean. My hands literally are clean. They were not bloodied, because everybody in that room stabbed Julius Caesar to death in a frenzy, including Brutus et tu, Brute, and even you, Brutus. He hadn't taken part. So Cicero decides, I'm going to step up, and I'm going to be kind of the impartial voice. Everybody knows that I've been writing, the tyrant must die, had to die, he says, about Cicero. And he calls for peace. He calls for unity among all of the factions and a return to the Republic under the Senate. But he's got Octavian, who's the heir, and Mark Antony, who's got the person he would like to think is the heir, and the soldiers. So Cicero says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to back Octavian. That's his bet. I'm going to back Octavian to get rid of Mark Antony, and then I'm going to get rid of Octavian as an enemy of the Republic. And this doesn't work. And once Mark Antony hears that, he has Cicero assassinated, and he has his tongue and his hand cut off, because Cicero was known as a good talker, and you would raise your hand and point to the sky, etc., and use your arms to gesture as you spoke, and that was Mark Antony's warning to anybody else who wanted to give him sass. So obviously we're back to the bloodletting of Marius and Sulla and Cinna. And yet again, Julius Caesar underestimated Octavian, 19, the underestimated nephew. What he does is he holds 10 days of games in his uncle's honor in this new month of July. Uncle Julius's month, Uncle Julius's celebration. And at the end of the 10 days, it is said, or at least Octavian said, look in the sky, there's a comet. That's the soul of my Uncle Julius becoming a god, the apotheosis, being raised, apex, apateo, theosis, to the level of the gods. Theos means gods. And therefore his soul becomes divine. Well, let's see. If Caesar's divine, and Octavian is the adopted heir, does that not make Octavian the son of a god? Not necessarily divine, but close enough for his purposes. And in fact, Octavian negotiates to have the Senate declare him, I'm going to give you the Latin and then the English, Imperator Caesar, the word Kaiser comes from Caesar, Divi Filius. To repeat, Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, son of the divine Emperor Caesar. Now you come after me, you come after Caesar, you come after Caesar, you come after a god. So Mark Antony and Octavian ally, politics makes strange bedfellows, to kill the assassins, and then they turn on each other. And here, Mark Antony makes a big mistake. He adopts Caesarion legally. He calls him, are you ready? King of Kings, and he declares Cleopatra his queen. Dumb, dumb, dumb. Because he is going to put a foreign woman on the throne of Rome, and he thinks they're going to accept that, and he's going to put the bastard son as the heir, and he thinks the Romans are going to accept that. He plays right into Octavian. Octavian says, this isn't a civil war. This is a war against a foreign enemy. Mark Antony, he says, is a traitor to Rome, sleeping with this foreign prostitute, protecting this bastard son. His language is incredible. What does he do? Mark Antony allowed Octavian, and Octavian being smart enough to turn a civil war, who wants a civil war, into a patriotic defense against a traitor and against a foreign mistress. And so now Octavian, given the authority by the Senate, goes on the attack against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And in the famous battle in the year 31 BCE at a place called Actium, Cleopatra is on one ship and Mark Antony is on another ship, and they really kind of can't see what's going on. And in the fog of battle, Mark Antony signals that he needs help to Cleopatra, and Cleopatra, looking across at her lover, leaves, abandons him. And so Mark Antony, believing that Cleopatra had killed herself, kills himself. Cleopatra kills herself, and now there's only one left standing. Just as no one would have thought Crassus and Pompey would have lost and Julius Caesar would have been the one left standing, who would have thought Mark Antony and Cleopatra and the assassins would have lost and left this boy standing? But this boy, Octavian, is now no longer the 19-year-old moving slowly to Rome. He's over 30 now. He's battle-tested. He's fought battles. He's got the army behind him. He is the son of a god. And Egypt now becomes a Roman province under the personal control of Octavian, soon to be declared emperor with the consent of the Republic. He's going to turn the place into an empire while saying again and again, I am doing no such thing. I am restoring a republic.